So what happened after communism? Well, here's the map of freedom that we looked at before. Actually, this is a 2008 version, I think. But I don't think it's changed very much. You can look at the 2013 version that I put on the previous slides as well. But really what you see is that the transition has gone much better in the western part of the post-communist world than in the eastern part, apart from the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania up here. But we'll talk more about this in a few minutes. All these countries, though, faced very similar problems in the immediate post-communist experience. You're talking about enormous change, simultaneous political and economic changes. These states were high capacity, high autonomy states. How and when do you move on administrative and economic reforms? Democracy is again, by nature, it's low autonomy, but you risk reducing state autonomy at a time when you're trying to do the state is trying to make serious reforms. So how can you transform if you have lower levels of autonomy, but how can you call yourselves a democracy unless you have these lower levels of autonomy? So it's very difficult to shrink state capacity for other reasons as well. I mean, you've got entrenched interests. You've got what you're going to have is the rising unemployment of people who know really how to do nothing else besides what they've done for however many years. You've got people who fear losing their stature, the military, people who fear losing their privileges, the factory bosses, others who are in the Communist Party upper echelons. For the state, how do you maintain capacity if you go after those who are tainted? The intelligence and the courts, those who are tainted with being in charge of a repressive apparatus for so long. So there are lots and lots of questions that emerge here. You've got the big question of political culture. We've got rapid changes in ideology and lifestyle. This involves a new attitude of elites and non-elites. Imagine if someone came to America and said, okay, capitalism, democracy was all wrong. It turns out communism won. So here's the new system. Well, people would be a little bit aghast and confused. But think about, the other aspects. You're trying to foster a respect for rule of law, where for decades in the Soviet Union, there wasn't a respect for the rule of law. And why should I respect the rule of law today when everyone else disregards it? If I don't, I'm going to lose out. I'm going to look like a loser. I'm going to be a loser. No one wants to be a loser. You also have, and this is a period of almost anarchy. Anarchy is a stretch. But it's a period of very loose reign as politicians are trying to figure out how the new democratic system works. You also have the growth in haves versus have-nots. If the communists did anything, what they did is they did a pretty good job equalizing society at fairly low levels, but relatively equal. Now you've got all these have-nots and a few haves, and people are increasingly angry about this. Again, back to political culture, people want more democracy, but they also prize the economic values that were historically emphasized. This means that people have very high expectations for the delivery of state services. Again, the cradle-to-grave services that were common. The euphoria that comes after a revolution or after a regime change just raises the expectations even further. Then you have all these other issues. You've got religious organizations coming in. They've never been there before. You've got questions of ethnic identity. You've got questions of justice, how to deal with people who were in charge of the repressive apparatus, while maintaining the capabilities that I mentioned before. Huge numbers of questions that come up in these cases. Second issue here, and this is another huge one, is where do we want the political change to go? We need a consensus on the direction. Do we want a presidential system, a parliamentary system, a semi-presidential system, something else? Where do we get the know-how to create these institutions? And especially the Constitution, which defines how these institutions will work and interact. There are lots of benefits to a parliamentary system. There's more social input. So leadership accountability should be higher, but it comes with a price. Political instability, potentially. Maybe it's going to be harder to perform, to implement reforms. The presidential system might be better for that. It might be easier to take tough decisions, but there's less accountability. In many cases that actually took the presidential system, it was an easy slide to authoritarianism. The same communist leaders then became presidents of their republics. They cracked down on glasnost. They went about reforms that increased their own power, political and economic. So these are very tough issues. Most in the western part of the communist world took on a parliamentary system with a strong prime minister, and they went social democratic. Others went actually far more liberal. It was sort of a pendulum. They went from communism all the way to liberalism, and then back a little bit as things sort of as they saw the realities. So moving on here to economic change, big questions of how fast and how far to go. Do you give up all the welfare programs? Do you sell all the state assets? Or do you maintain strategic ones? What is strategic? The whole process necessitates marketization. By marketization, we mean introducing supply and demand forces where they hadn't existed before. We're also talking about privatization, transferring state property to private ownership. The state can't afford to keep running these things. You need technical skills to do this, but it's still uncharted therapy. Remember, uncharted territory. And when I said therapy, I was thinking about shock therapy that happened in Poland. Russia tried it a little bit. People didn't know how to do this. Should we do shock therapy? Should we do all this at once? Or should we pursue a more gradualist policy? No one knew because this sort of experiment had never been done before, going from communism to capitalism. Just like pursuing communism, again, they didn't know how to do that either. Marx didn't tell them, so they had to figure it out. It did a horrible job. All this is politically risky. We've got short-term pain, inflation, ending subsidies, huge unemployment as these state factories close or are sold off and people realize how ineffective they are. Perceptions of corrupt privatization in a land where equality had long been the general norm. Not for everybody, but for a large majority. And now you've got huge differences and polarizing society. Politics and economics are intricately linked. The state lacks capital until it can prove to investors that it's stable. People aren't going to invest in the state until they can prove that it's stable. So who's going to buy these things, these factories and all that? And we'll talk more about the privatization process when we talk about Russia. But it was a process characterized by lots of corruption across the post-communist world. So generally there was lots of disappointment in the transition, but especially among the older generations and those who were less educated. They lost hard as they lost their pensions, social services dried up, jobs became scarcer, the economy demanded new skills that people didn't have. Hence, when we talked about democracy, I mentioned the Polish beer lovers party, right? People said, okay, democracy is no good. Let's get this Polish beer lovers party in power. Now, the transition has been more successful where a couple things have occurred. First, there was an earlier tradition of democracy and capitalism and civil society. And second, where there was a shorter period of communism. And so here we're mostly talking about the Central European states. Though it's notable that none of these had extensive democratic histories, there is a correlation. The GDP in these states, primarily in the West, went up by about 25% over the decade or plus, probably, after communism. In the post-Soviet Union, they actually went down around 20%, if the stats are correct. Now, they could have gone down further. When I say if the stats are correct, it's because many of these are non-transparent regimes. The ones that are blue here are non-transparent regimes, and so they can move the data where they want to in some ways. So generally, transition has gone much better in the West versus in the East. These would be the Eastern countries here. Belarus also, and this is a little piece of Russia right there, with the exception of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Baltics, right here. So they've actually done really well too. There are other important exceptions. We've had ethnic violence, largely economic in nature, between states of the former Yugoslavia, Armenia and Azerbaijan, Georgia, Tajikistan. We're talking about civil war. Hundreds of thousands killed, millions displaced internally or externally, allegations of war crimes and genocide in each of these conflicts. One of them, the Yugoslavia one, actually leading to the first International Criminal Tribunal since World War II ended. In 1990, Westerners thought there would be this new global order without communism. There would be more international cooperation. And instead, what we saw is a more threatening paradigm involving non-state actors, with terrorists in particular, taking hold, and lots of organized crime in the post-communist world. Now, one more note that I'll make here before we end is that China looks very different. They pursued economic changes. I was actually in Tiananmen on the fifth year, on the Tiananmen Square, I mean, in Beijing, on the fifth year anniversary of events. And there was nothing much going on. There were lots of police, marked and unmarked, walking around. But really what's going on is the Chinese have used economic reform to stave off political reform. Go back to Marx, give them crumbs, and a new false consciousness emerges. So that could be what we're seeing in China, although I think it's much more complicated, and we'll talk about that when we get to the China case. So you're done with communism. Well, unless you're